The shovel hit the dirt, again and again. 43 men sat on their horses in absolute silence. Not a word, not a whisper, not even the horses dared to move. The only sound in that Missouri clearing was metal biting into earth, and the heavy breathing of the man doing the digging. His name was Thomas Whitfield, 22 years old. He had ridden with Bloody Bill Anderson for 11 months, killed 17 Union soldiers, never hesitated, never questioned, never showed weakness, until today. Bill Anderson sat motionless on his black horse, watching. His face showed nothing. His eyes showed less. In his right hand he held a Colt Navy revolver, not aimed at anyone, just held. A reminder. Thomas dug. The hole was now 3 feet deep. The Missouri sun beat down through the trees, but the clearing felt cold. Every man watching knew what that hole was for. Every man had seen it before. Thomas was digging his own grave. But here is what none of them understood yet. What would make this day different from every other execution they had witnessed? What would haunt Jesse James for the rest of his life? The grave was not for Thomas, but we will get to that. First, you need to understand what happened 3 hours earlier, what order Thomas refused, and why Bill Anderson, the most feared man in Missouri, did not simply shoot him where he stood. The morning had started like any other in the guerrilla camp. 43 bushwhackers hidden in the dense woods of Carroll County, Missouri, September 1864. The war was turning against the Confederacy, but in these forests, Bill Anderson and his men were winning. Winning through terror, winning through speed, winning through absolute unwavering discipline. That discipline was not cruelty for its own sake, it was survival. To understand what happened in that clearing, you first need to understand the world these men lived in. The war in Missouri was unlike any other theater of the Civil War. There were no great armies marching in formation, no grand strategies drawn up by generals in distant headquarters, no rules of engagement. This was a shadow war, a war of ambushes and reprisals, of midnight raids and dawn massacres, of neighbors killing neighbors over politics, land, or simply old grudges given new excuses. The Union called their guerrilla enemies bushwhackers, men who hid in the brush and struck without warning, men who wore no uniforms, followed no military code, and gave no quarter. The Confederacy called them patriots, defenders of Southern rights against Northern tyranny. The truth was simpler and uglier. They were survivors, men who had watched Union soldiers burn their farms, murder their livestock, imprison their families, men who had nowhere else to go and nothing left to lose, men who had learned that in Missouri in 1864, you were either predator or prey. Bill Anderson had chosen to be a predator, and he was very, very good at it. His men called him Bloody Bill, not as an insult, as a statement of fact. The blood on his hands, on his clothes, on his saddle, told the story of 100 engagements. 1,000 Union soldiers who had underestimated the young man with the cold eyes. But Bill did not become Bloody Bill overnight. He was made, forged in a furnace of loss and rage that would have destroyed lesser men. Union patrols hunted them constantly. Federal cavalry swept through Missouri looking for guerrilla camps, and the worst threat of all, traitors, men who would sell out their companions for Union gold or amnesty. Bill Anderson had learned this lesson the hard way. 3 months earlier, a man named Patterson had slipped away from camp in the night. By dawn, Union cavalry had surrounded their position. 14 of Bill's men died in the ambush. 14 men who had trusted Patterson. 14 men who had shared food with him, slept beside him, called him brother. Patterson was eventually captured. What Bill did to him took 4 hours. No one who witnessed it ever spoke of it again. After that day, Bill made a rule, absolute, unbreakable. His voice had been calm when he addressed his men. Every man here follows every order I give. No hesitation, no questions, no exceptions. The moment I see doubt in a man's eyes, that man is a danger to us all, and dangers get eliminated. For 11 months, no one had tested that rule, until Thomas Whitfield. Thomas Whitfield had come to Bill Anderson's band in the autumn of 1863, just weeks after Josephine's death. He was one of many young men fleeing Union persecution in those dark days. His farm had been burned, his father beaten by Union militia, His mother forced to watch as everything they owned went up in flames. Like so many others, Thomas had nowhere else to go. He proved himself quickly. In his first engagement, a skirmish with a Union patrol near Rocheport, Thomas killed 3 soldiers in less than a minute. His hands did not shake. His aim did not waver. He simply did what needed to be done. Bill noticed. Over the following months, Thomas rose through the ranks of the guerrilla band. Not through politics or favoritism. There was no time for such things in the Bush War. But through sheer effectiveness. When Bill needed something done, Thomas did it. When Bill needed someone reliable, Thomas was there. They were not friends. Bill Anderson did not have friends. He had men who followed him and men who died. Thomas was content to be among those who followed. But Thomas had a secret that would surface on this September morning and nearly cost him his life. He had family in the Union Army, not just distant relatives, not forgotten cousins from another state. His mother's sister had married a Union sympathizer in Kansas City before the war. Their children, Thomas's first cousins, had grown up playing with him every summer, swimming in the same creeks, climbing the same trees, sharing the same blood. When the war came, those cousins chose differently than Thomas. 2 of them put on the blue uniform. One died at Wilson's Creek in 1861. The other was named Samuel, and he was sitting tied to a tree in Bill Anderson's camp waiting to die. Thomas had recognized him immediately. The same eyes, the same shape of the face, the same birthmark on the left hand that their grandmother used to say marked them as blessed, blessed. Looking at Samuel now, bruised, bloodied, terrified, Thomas could not imagine anything less blessed. The patrol had captured a Union soldier the night before. He was young, maybe 19, wearing the blue uniform of a Missouri militia unit. The same units that burned Confederate farms, murdered civilians, and imprisoned women and children in collapsing buildings. The same units that had killed Bill Anderson's sister. Let me tell you about Josephine Anderson. She was 14 years old when she died. 14 years old. The same age as the youngest guerrillas riding with her brother. She had brown hair like Bill's, the same determined set to her jaw, the same fire in her eyes. In August 1863, Union authorities in Kansas City had rounded up the women and girls connected to known bushwhackers, sisters, mothers, wives. They called it a security measure, a way to control the guerrillas by holding their families hostage. They imprisoned these women in a 3-story building on Grand Avenue, a building that Union engineers knew was structurally unsound, a building that had been condemned before the war. On August 13, 1863, that building collapsed. 5 women died immediately, among them Josephine Anderson. But she did not die quickly. Survivors would later testify that they heard Josephine screaming beneath the rubble, calling out for help, begging someone to dig her out. Her cries lasted for 6 minutes before they stopped. 6 minutes. Bill Anderson was 50 miles away when it happened. He did not learn of his sister's death until 3 days later. When he finally reached Kansas City, he went to the site of the collapse, dug through the rubble himself. He found her dress, torn, blood-soaked, still warm from the summer sun. He took that dress, folded it carefully, put it in his saddlebag, and he never took it out again, for the rest of his life, until the day he died. Josephine's bloody dress rode with him, a reminder, a motivation, a reason to keep fighting when other men would have surrendered. After that day, Bill Anderson stopped being a guerrilla fighter. He became something else entirely. The 53 scalps on his saddle. Those came after Josephine died. The reputation for brutality that made Union soldiers fear to speak his name. That came after. The cold emptiness in his eyes that terrified even his own men. That came after. Everything that Bill Anderson became. Everything that would happen in that clearing with Thomas Whitfield. It all traced back to a 14-year-old girl screaming beneath the rubble of a collapsing building. The prisoner sat tied to a tree, watching the bushwhackers eat breakfast around a small fire. His face was pale. He knew what happened to Union soldiers captured by Bloody Bill. Everyone knew. The stories had spread across Missouri like wildfire. Bill Anderson approached the prisoner slowly. He did not speak. He simply studied the young man's face for a long moment. Then he turned to Thomas Whitfield. "Thomas, you will execute the prisoner." It was not an unusual order. They had done this before, many times. The war in Missouri had no rules, no prisoners, no mercy. Both sides killed captured enemies. Bill Anderson simply did it more efficiently than most. Thomas reached for his pistol and stopped. His hand froze 6 inches from the grip. His face went white. His eyes locked onto the prisoner's face. And something in those eyes changed. Bill noticed immediately. "Thomas, I gave you an order." Thomas did not move. His hand remained frozen in the air. Every man in the camp was now watching. Jesse James, 17 years old, stopped eating. Frank James slowly reached for his own weapon, sensing something was wrong. The prisoner spoke then. His voice was shaking, but the words were clear. Tommy, please. It is me. Samuel. We played together as children. Please." Thomas closed his eyes, and Bill Anderson understood everything. The prisoner was Thomas Whitfield's cousin. The moment stretched into eternity. Every guerrilla in that clearing was frozen, waiting, watching, their hands near their weapons, ready for whatever came next. Bill Anderson's expression had not changed. His face remained as blank as a winter sky. But behind those empty eyes, calculations were running, probabilities being weighed, outcomes being predicted. He had known about Thomas's family connections. Of course he had. Bill Anderson made it his business to know everything about the men who rode with him, their histories, their secrets, their weaknesses. He had known that someday this moment might come. And now it had. The question was not whether Thomas would kill his cousin. The prisoner was dead either way. No Union soldier captured by bloody Bill Anderson lived to tell about it. That was the rule. That was the reality. The question was how Thomas would react, whether he would break, whether the bonds of blood would prove stronger than the bonds of war, and if they did, whether Bill would have to make an example. Samuel, the prisoner, was still talking, babbling now, the words pouring out in a desperate flood. "Tommy, remember Grandma's house? Remember the summers? We would catch fireflies in the back field. You and me and Daniel. Before Daniel died. Before any of this. Tommy, please. I do not want to die like this. Please." Thomas's eyes were closed. His hands were shaking. For the first time in 11 months, he looked like what he was. A young man torn apart by impossible choices, and Bill Anderson watched it all with patient, predatory interest. In another army, in another war, this might have been forgiven. A man discovering his own blood among the enemy, a moment of hesitation that any human being would understand. But this was not another army. This was Bill Anderson's guerrillas, and hesitation meant death. Bill did not raise his voice. He did not show anger. He simply dismounted from his horse and walked toward Thomas with slow, deliberate steps. His boots crunched on the dry leaves. The sound was deafening in the silence. "Thomas, look at me." Thomas opened his eyes. They were wet. "I understand." Bill's voice was almost gentle. "I understand what you are feeling right now. You see your cousin. You see the boy you grew up with. You remember the games you played, the meals you shared, the blood you share." Thomas nodded slightly, relief beginning to show on his face. "But that boy..." Bill gestured toward the prisoner. "That boy put on a Union uniform. That uniform burned my farm. That uniform murdered my neighbors. That uniform..." Bill's voice hardened. "That uniform locked my 14-year-old sister in a collapsing building and let her scream for 6 minutes while the walls crushed her." Thomas said nothing. "Your cousin made a choice. He chose his side. And now you are choosing yours." Bill stepped back. His hand moved to his saddlebag and withdrew something. A shovel. The same shovel he had carried since Lawrence. The same shovel he had used to bury what remained of the building that killed Josephine. He tossed it at Thomas's feet. "You have 20 minutes to dig, deep enough for a man to lie in, wide enough for shoulders. When you are done, We will see what happens next. Thomas looked at the shovel, then at his cousin, then at Bill, and he began to dig. This is where most people misunderstand Bill Anderson. They see the violence. They see the scalps on his saddle, 53 of them by this point. They see the bodies he left behind at Centralia, at Lawrence, at a dozen other places. They see a monster, but monsters do not give a man 20 minutes. Monsters do not hand over shovels instead of bullets. What Bill Anderson was doing in that clearing was not sadism. It was not cruelty for entertainment. It was something far more calculated, something that only men who have led other men in combat can truly understand. He was making a point. Every guerrilla watching that scene understood the message. Family did not matter. Friendship did not matter. Childhood memories did not matter. The only thing that mattered was the unit. The only loyalty that mattered was to the men beside you, because in this war, in these woods, anything else would get them all killed. Bill could have shot Thomas immediately. It would have been faster, cleaner, but it would have taught nothing. The other men would have seen a leader who killed without thought, a madman, someone to fear but not to follow. Instead, Bill gave them something else. He gave them time to think, time to watch Thomas dig, time to imagine themselves in that hole, time to understand, truly understand, what it meant to be part of this group. And somewhere in that clearing, a 17-year-old boy named Jesse James was learning something he would never forget. Jesse James would later become the most famous outlaw in American history. Bank robber, train robber, cold-blooded killer. A legend whose name still echoes through American culture more than a century after his death. But in that moment, in that Missouri clearing, he was just a boy. 17 years old, barely old enough to shave, already old enough to kill. Jesse had joined the guerrillas 6 months earlier, following his older brother Frank into Bill Anderson's band. He had proven himself brave in battle, quick with a pistol, unflinching in violence. But there was still something soft in him, something that had not yet been completely burned away. That something was dying now. As he watched Thomas dig, as he saw the sweat and blood and desperation, as he heard the prisoner begging for mercy that would not come, Jesse James felt the last fragments of his childhood crumbling away. This was no longer a game. This was no longer an adventure. This was survival at its most brutal and its most honest. And Jesse was paying attention. Frank James, 2 years older and infinitely more cynical, leaned close to his brother. Watch everything. Remember everything. This is how you stay alive. Jesse nodded. His hand rested on the grip of his Colt revolver, not because he expected to use it, but because it was comforting, solid, real, unlike everything else in his life right now. The first 10 minutes were the hardest. Thomas dug in silence. The dirt of Missouri was soft from recent rains, but the roots of oak trees ran through it like veins. His shovel caught on them again and again. His hands began to blister. Sweat poured down his face. His cousin Samuel watched from the tree, crying now, begging, "Tommy, please. Tommy, you do not have to do this. They will let us go. Just tell them you will not. Tommy." Thomas did not respond. He kept digging. Bill Anderson sat back on his horse, patient, unmoving. His eyes never left Thomas. The other guerrillas shifted uncomfortably. Some wanted to look away. None dared. This was a lesson, and they were meant to learn it. Frank James leaned over to his younger brother and whispered something. Jesse nodded slightly, but did not take his eyes off the scene. At the 15-minute mark, the hole was waist-deep on Thomas. His shirt was soaked through. His hands were bleeding where blisters had torn open. His arms shook with exhaustion. But he kept digging. Archie Clement, Bill's second in command, a man who had killed more Union soldiers than anyone could count, rode his horse closer to Bill. He is loyal. He is just confused. We could use a man like him. Bill did not look at Archie. His eyes remained fixed on Thomas. I know he is loyal. That is why he is still breathing. Then why? Because loyalty is not enough. Bill's voice was quiet, meant only for Archie. A dog is loyal. I need men who understand. Men who will do what must be done even when it breaks them, especially when it breaks them. Archie said nothing more. At 18 minutes, the hole was chest deep. Thomas could barely lift his arms. Each shovel full of dirt seemed to weigh 100 pounds. His breath came in ragged gasps. Samuel had stopped begging. He sat against the tree, staring at his cousin with empty eyes. Perhaps he had accepted his fate. Perhaps he had simply run out of tears. At 19 minutes, Bill raised his hand. "Thomas, stop." Thomas froze. The shovel fell from his hands. He stood in the hole he had dug, the grave he had dug, and looked up at Bill Anderson. His eyes asked the question he could not speak. Was this the end? Bill dismounted again. He walked to the edge of the hole and looked down at Thomas for a long moment. Then he reached out his hand. Thomas hesitated, then took it. Bill pulled him out of the grave. Thomas stood there covered in Missouri dirt, his hands raw and bleeding, his body shaking with exhaustion. He looked at Bill Anderson with eyes that held no hope, no expectation, only acceptance of whatever came next. For a moment, just a moment, something flickered in Bill's expression, something that might have been recognition or understanding, or perhaps just memory. He too had stood in a similar place, covered in dirt, searching for what remained of his sister in the ruins of that Kansas City building. He too had felt the weight of impossible loss, the crushing knowledge that the world had broken something in him that could never be fixed. Perhaps that was why he did not simply shoot Thomas where he stood. Perhaps that was why the next thing he did would haunt every man in that clearing for the rest of their lives. Or perhaps Bill Anderson was simply a monster who enjoyed watching others suffer. History has never been able to decide. What happened next is what separates this story from every other tale of guerrilla brutality. Bill walked to the tree where Samuel was tied. He drew his knife, the same knife that had taken 53 scalps, and cut the ropes. Samuel collapsed onto the ground, shaking, crying, unable to believe he was being freed. Thomas watched, hope beginning to dawn on his face. Maybe Bill understood. Maybe blood was thicker than war. Maybe. Bill grabbed Samuel by the collar and dragged him to the hole. "Get in." Samuel looked at the grave, looked at Bill, looked at Thomas. "Please, no, and please." Bill's voice did not change. It remained calm, almost kind. "You have two choices. Get in the hole, or I shoot you here and throw your body in after. Either way, you are going in that hole." Samuel climbed into the grave and Bill turned to Thomas. "You dug it, now fill it." Thomas's face went white. His mouth opened. No words came out. "The shovel is right there." Bill pointed at the ground. "Start with the legs, work your way up. By the time you reach his chest, he will stop screaming." This was the lesson. Not the digging, not the humiliation, not the 20 minutes of physical torture. The lesson was this: Thomas had refused to pull a trigger. A quick death. A merciful death. Because of that hesitation, because of that weakness, his cousin would now die slowly, buried alive, screaming, suffocating on Missouri dirt, and Thomas would be the one to do it. Thomas looked at the shovel, looked at his cousin in the hole, looked at Bill Anderson, and he understood. Bill had given him a choice, a simple choice: kill quickly or kill slowly, show mercy or show none. But either way, the prisoner died. Either way, Thomas proved his loyalty. The only question was how much suffering that proof would cost. Thomas picked up the shovel. His cousin started screaming, "Tommy, no. Tommy, please. We are blood. We are family. You cannot." Thomas threw the first shovel of dirt. It landed on Samuel's boots. The young man in the hole jerked backward, pressing himself against the dirt wall, as if he could escape, as if there was anywhere to go. The second shovel landed on his shins, the third on his knees. Samuel was sobbing now, begging, praying, calling out names. His mother, his father, God himself. Anything that might save him from what was coming. Thomas's face had gone blank. His eyes were empty. Something inside him had broken, and something else had taken its place. Something cold, something necessary. By the time the dirt reached Samuel's waist, the screaming had become animal. No words, just sound. pure terror given voice. Bill Anderson watched without expression. Jesse James watched with something that might have been horror, or might have been fascination. Frank James had looked away. Even he had limits. Archie Clement smiled. When the dirt reached Samuel's chest, his screaming became muffled, choking. The weight of the earth pressing against his lungs, making each breath harder than the last. Thomas kept shoveling. The sun had moved across the sky. What had started as morning was now approaching noon. The shadows in the clearing had shortened, leaving nowhere to hide from the merciless light. Every guerrilla watching had their own thoughts, their own memories, their own fears. Some thought of their own families, brothers they had not seen since the war began, cousins who had joined different sides, the terrible possibility that someday they might face the same choice Thomas was making now. Others thought of survival, of the lesson Bill was teaching, of the absolute necessity of obedience in a world where hesitation meant death, and some, a few, thought of escape, wondered if there was any way out of this band of killers, any path back to the normal lives they had known before the war. But those thoughts died quickly. There was no escape. They had all seen what happened to deserters. They had all participated in the punishments. They were bound together now by blood and violence, and the only way out was death. Thomas understood this now. With every shovel of dirt, he understood it more clearly. His arms burned, his hands bled, his soul, whatever remained of it, had gone silent. There was only the shovel, only the dirt, only the rising level of earth that would soon cover his cousin forever, at the last moment, just before the dirt covered Samuel's face. Bill Anderson raised his hand again. Stop. Thomas stopped. Bill walked to the edge of the hole, looked down at Samuel. Only his head remained visible, surrounded by packed earth. He was hyperventilating, tears streaming down dirt-covered cheeks. Bill drew his Colt Navy revolver and shot Samuel once in the head. The body jerked, then went still. Bill turned to Thomas. Finish it. Thomas threw the last shovel of dirt over his cousin's dead face. The sound of the last clod of earth hitting the mound was the loudest thing Thomas had ever heard. Louder than gunfire, louder than cannon, louder than the screams that had filled the clearing just moments before. He stood there, leaning on the shovel, staring at the fresh grave. His hands had gone numb. His mind had gone somewhere else. Some distant place where none of this was real. Bill Anderson walked to his side, stood next to him, looking down at the mound of dirt that held what remained of Samuel Whitfield. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then Bill said, his voice quiet enough that only Thomas could hear, "You understand now?" Thomas nodded. His voice would not work. Perhaps it never would again. Not really. Bill continued, "I knew about your cousin before we captured him. I knew the patrol would bring him in. I knew this moment would come." Thomas turned to look at his commander, something like betrayal flickering in his eyes. This was a test. Bill nodded slowly. Everything is a test. Every moment, every choice. The only question is whether you pass or whether you fail. And if I had failed? Bill looked back at the grave. Then there would be 2 mounds of dirt in this clearing instead of 1. Thomas absorbed this in silence. Bill placed a hand on his shoulder. The touch was almost gentle, almost human. "You passed. You are one of us now, completely. Whatever you were before, whatever connections you had to that other world, they are buried in that hole, along with everything else." He turned and walked back toward his horse. "We ride for Fayette in 3 days. Get some rest, clean those hands." And Thomas looked up. Bill's face was empty again, all trace of humanity gone. "I will never have to test you again, because if there is ever another moment of hesitation, I will not give you a shovel. I will give you a bullet." He mounted his horse and rode to the edge of the clearing. Thomas stood alone beside his cousin's grave, and somewhere inside him, the last fragment of Thomas Whitfield, the man he had been before the war, before the killing, before the 20 minutes of digging, died. In its place stood something else, something forged in blood and dirt, something that would ride with bloody Bill Anderson until the bitter end, something that no longer hesitated. That night, the camp was silent. No one sang. No one joked. No one did any of the things that soldiers do to forget what they have seen and done. They sat around small fires, eating cold meat and harder bread, staring into the flames. Thomas Whitfield sat alone. His hands were wrapped in bloody bandages. His eyes had not returned to normal, perhaps they never would. Jesse James approached him slowly. The young man, barely more than a boy, sat down beside the older guerrilla. For a long time, neither spoke. Finally, Jesse broke the silence. Why did he do it like that? He could have just shot both of you. It would have been faster. Thomas did not look up. That was not the point. Then what was? Thomas finally met Jesse's eyes, and what Jesse saw there would stay with him forever. Bill could have killed me. Should have killed me. I disobeyed an order in front of everyone. That is death. There is no other answer. Then why? Because Bill does not just want obedience. Thomas's voice was hollow. He wants understanding. He wants us to know, to really know. What this war costs, what we become, what we give up. Jesse considered this. Your cousin. My cousin chose the wrong side. Thomas's voice cracked slightly. I knew it when he put on that uniform. I knew it when I saw him tied to that tree. I hoped. You hoped Bill would let him go? Thomas laughed. A bitter, broken sound. No. I hoped I would not have to be the one to kill him. I hoped someone else would do it. Take that choice away from me. He gestured toward the fresh mound of dirt at the edge of the clearing. Bill made sure I understood. There is no one else. There is no escape. When the moment comes, you either do what must be done, or you die. There is no third option. Jesse absorbed this in silence. Then he asked the question that had been haunting him since the burial ended. Did it work? Do you understand now? Thomas stared at the mound of dirt, his cousin's grave, his own grave in a way, the grave of whoever he had been before today. I understand. His voice was barely a whisper. God help me. I understand. He looked at Jesse, eyes that had aged a decade in a single day. And someday, you will too. Bill Anderson did not sleep that night. He sat apart from his men, cleaning his weapons by the light of a small fire. The same ritual he performed every night, the same movements he had made 1,000 times, mechanical, precise, empty. Archie Clement approached and sat beside him. You went easy on him. Bill did not look up from his work. He disobeyed an order. In front of everyone, by rights he should be dead. That is not going easy. Bill's voice was quiet. That is making sure he never disobeys again. A dead man teaches nothing. A broken man teaches everyone. Archie considered this. You think he will stay? I think he has nowhere else to go. Bill set down the pistol he had been cleaning and picked up another. His cousin is dead. His family will never forgive him. The Union will hang him if they catch him. He belongs to us now, completely. And if he runs... Bill smiled, a cold expression that never reached his eyes. He will not run. He dug that grave himself. He knows exactly how deep it is. He knows what it feels like to stand in it. If he runs, he knows I will make him dig another one. And next time, there will be no bullet at the end. Archie nodded slowly. The men are scared. Good. Bill returned to his cleaning. Scared men pay attention. Scared men follow orders. Scared men survive. He paused, looked up at Archie. We are going to hit Fayette in 3 days. The Union garrison there thinks they are safe. They have walls, they have artillery, they have 300 men. Archie raised an eyebrow. We have 43. Bill smiled again. 43 men who will follow any order I give. 43 men who have seen what happens to those who hesitate. 43 men who understand that the only way out of this war is through it. He looked toward the distant horizon, toward the Union garrison that did not yet know death was coming. 300 men behind walls, or 43 men who fear nothing but their own commander. That is not a fair fight, Archie. Archie laughed. No, sir, it is not. The two men sat in comfortable silence for a while. The fire crackled between them. Somewhere in the distance, An owl called Bill. Archie spoke carefully. The James boys. They watched the whole thing today, the younger one especially. He has not stopped staring at the grave. Bill nodded slowly. Good. He needs to learn. Learn what? Bill set down the pistol he was cleaning, picked up another. When I was his age, I thought I knew what war was. I thought it was about honor and courage and fighting for what you believe in. I thought there were rules. He paused, his eyes distant, remembering. Then they killed Josephine, and I learned what war really is. It is about survival, about doing whatever you must do to live one more day, about becoming something that can function in hell. He looked at Archie. Jesse James is 17 years old. He thinks he is a warrior. He thinks he is a hero. Today he learned that he is neither. He is just a man, surrounded by other men, trying not to die. Archie nodded. And Thomas, what is he now? Bill smiled, that cold expression that never reached his eyes. Thomas is exactly what I need him to be. A weapon, one that will never misfire again. The fire popped and crackled. In 3 days, they would ride against Fayette. In 3 days, that weapon would prove its worth. 3 days later, Bill Anderson and his guerrillas would ride into Fayette. The battle would last 17 minutes. 114 Union soldiers would die. Bill would lose 4 men. The attack on Fayette became legend among the guerrillas, not because of its success, they had won many such fights before, but because of how they won it. When the Union defenders saw 43 horsemen riding toward their fortified position, they laughed. 300 trained soldiers behind walls, with artillery and supplies, against a ragged band of bushwhackers. They stopped laughing when the first volley came. Bill Anderson led from the front, as always, his horse plunging through the defenders' outer works, his revolvers spitting fire, his voice cutting through the chaos, directing his men with absolute precision. And beside him, matching him kill for kill, was Thomas Whitfield. The transformation was complete. The man who had hesitated over his cousin 3 days earlier now moved through the battle like death itself. No wasted motion, no pause for mercy, just cold, mechanical efficiency. Union soldiers fell before him. Some begged for quarter. Thomas gave none. His face remained blank as he fired, reloaded, fired again. Jesse James, fighting nearby, watched Thomas with something approaching awe. This was what Bill had created. This was the result of the shovel, the grave, the 20 minutes of digging. A man with nothing left inside but the will to survive. A man just like Bill Anderson. A man that Jesse James would someday become. When the battle ended, when the last Union defender had fallen or fled, the guerrillas gathered in the town square, covered in blood and powder smoke, surrounded by the bodies of their enemies. Bill Anderson rode among them, nodding approval. His eyes found Thomas, lingered there for a moment. Thomas stared back. No expression, no emotion. Bill smiled. The weapon was complete. Thomas Whitfield would kill 11 Union soldiers that day, more than any other guerrilla except Bill himself. He never hesitated again. In the weeks that followed, something changed in Thomas Whitfield. The other guerrillas noticed it first. The way he moved through camp now, silent, watchful, his eyes constantly scanning for threats, for weakness, for doubt in the faces of his companions. He spoke less, laughed never. When new recruits joined the band, young men fleeing Union persecution or seeking adventure, Thomas was the one who tested them, who put them through trials to see if they had what it took. None of those trials were as severe as what Thomas had endured, but they were enough. Enough to weed out the weak, enough to forge the survivors into the kind of men who could ride with bloody Bill Anderson. Jesse James watched Thomas closely during those weeks, learning from him, absorbing the lessons that the older man embodied. One night around a dying fire, Jesse asked him, "Do you think about it? What you did?" Thomas stared into the coals for a long moment. "I think about it every time I close my eyes. I hear the shovel hitting dirt. I hear Samuel screaming. I feel the weight of the earth in my hands." He looked up at Jesse, his eyes empty wells of darkness, "But I do not regret it. That is what Bill taught me. There is no room for regret. There is only what you do, and whether you survive it." Jesse nodded slowly. "And if you had to do it again?" Thomas picked up a stick and stirred the dying fire. "I would dig faster." That was the lesson. Not to avoid the terrible choices, but to make them quickly, completely, without the weakness of hesitation. Jesse James carried that lesson with him for the rest of his life. Years later, long after the war had ended, long after Bill Anderson was dead and buried, long after the guerrilla bands had scattered to the winds, Jesse James would sit in hotel rooms and saloons and hideouts across America, and he would think about that day. He would think about Thomas digging. He would think about Samuel screaming. He would think about Bill Anderson's calm voice, giving orders that no sane man would follow, and watching them followed anyway. When Jesse robbed his first bank in 1866, he thought of Bill. When he killed his first man outside of combat, he thought of Bill. When he became the most wanted man in America, with a price on his head and Pinkerton detectives hunting him across a dozen states, he thought of that shovel hitting Missouri dirt. The lesson had burned itself into his soul, become part of who he was, shaped every decision he would ever make. Do not hesitate, do not question, do what must be done and do it completely. Bill Anderson had created a monster that day in the clearing, not Thomas Whitfield. Thomas had merely been the raw material. The real monster was the 17-year-old boy watching from his horse, the boy who absorbed every lesson with eyes wide open, Jesse James, the man who would terrorize America for 16 years, the man whose name still echoes through history, the man who learned everything he knew about survival from bloody Bill Anderson, and from a guerrilla who dug his cousin's grave. History remembers bloody Bill Anderson as a monster, and in many ways, he was. The scalps, the executions, the terror he spread across Missouri. All of it is documented, all of it is true. He was one of the most feared men in American history, and he earned that reputation through actions that horrify us even today. But history often forgets the context. It forgets that Bill Anderson was 23 years old when his sister died. 14 years old, Josephine, crushed to death in a collapsing building that Union soldiers had knowingly weakened. She screamed for 6 minutes before she went silent. Bill heard about it 3 days later. He found her bloody dress in the rubble. He kept it in his saddlebag for the rest of his life. History forgets that the war in Missouri was not a war of armies and battles. It was a war of neighbors murdering neighbors, farms burning, families destroyed, both sides committing atrocities that would make modern soldiers weep. History forgets that Bill Anderson did not create this brutality. He was shaped by it, forged by it, broken by it. The historians who study the Missouri Guerrilla War have a term for what happened to men like Bill Anderson and Thomas Whitfield. They call it moral injury, the psychological damage that comes from doing things that violate your core beliefs, from becoming someone you never wanted to be. Every Union soldier Thomas killed, every scalp Bill took, every prisoner executed, every farm burned, every act of violence that went beyond the bounds of ordinary warfare. Each one carved a piece away from whatever humanity they had left, but they could not stop. That was the terrible irony. The very brutality that was destroying them was also keeping them alive. In the Bush War of Missouri, mercy was suicide, hesitation was death. The only way to survive was to become something that no longer hesitated. Bill Anderson understood this better than anyone. He had seen men try to hold on to their humanity, seen them pause at the wrong moment, seen them die because they could not bring themselves to do what the war demanded. So he made monsters, deliberately, methodically. Men like Thomas Whitfield, who had buried their humanity in Missouri dirt along with their cousins, their friends, their former selves. Monsters who could function in hell, monsters who could survive. And in breaking, he became something that could not be broken again. The scene in that clearing, Thomas digging his grave, burying his cousin alive, becoming something other than human, that was not sadism. It was survival. It was Bill Anderson passing on the only lesson that had kept him alive. This war will take everything from you. Your family, your mercy, your soul. Accept that now. Or die pretending you can keep any of it. 43 men learned that lesson watching Thomas dig. 43 men rode into Fayette 3 days later, willing to do anything Bill ordered. 43 men survived a war that killed hundreds of thousands. Was it worth it? That is not a question Bill Anderson ever asked himself. He did not have the luxury of philosophy. He did not have time for morality. He had enemies to kill and men to keep alive. Everything else was just shoveling dirt. Thomas Whitfield survived the war. But survival meant different things to different men. When Bill Anderson died in October 1864, shot through the head in an ambush near Albany, Missouri, the guerrilla band shattered. Some men surrendered. Some fled west. Some kept fighting until the final Confederate surrender in 1865. Thomas was among those who fled. He was present when Union soldiers shot Bill from his horse. He saw the body fall, saw the Union troops swarm over it like vultures, saw them strip the corpse of weapons, clothing, the famous saddle with its grisly decorations. He heard them cheering, celebrating the death of bloody Bill Anderson as if they had slain a demon. And maybe they had. Thomas did not stay to watch. He turned his horse and rode into the Missouri woods. Behind him, he could hear the sound of axes, the Union soldiers hacking apart what remained of his commander. They would display Bill's body in Richmond for 3 days. Women would come to stab the corpse. Men would spit on it. Children would be lifted up to see the monster who had terrorized their state. Thomas never saw any of it. He was already 50 miles away, riding toward a future he could not imagine. He rode with the remaining guerrillas until the surrender in 1865, then disappeared into the chaos of the post-war South. There are scattered reports of a man matching his description, working as a ranch hand in Texas, then California, then the Arizona territories, always moving, always looking over his shoulder. The war was over, but men like Thomas Whitfield never stopped fighting it. In their dreams, in their memories, in the cold sweat that woke them at 3 in the morning. There are no records of Thomas Whitfield after 1871. No death certificate, no grave marker, just silence. Perhaps he found peace. Perhaps he died alone, still seeing his cousin's face whenever he closed his eyes. Perhaps the man who walked out of that Missouri clearing in 1864 was already dead in every way that mattered. Jesse James would go on to become the most famous outlaw in American history. And years later, when reporters asked him how he had become so cold, so ruthless, so willing to kill without hesitation, he always thought of Thomas Whitfield, always thought of that shovel hitting dirt, always thought of Bill Anderson's calm voice. You dug it, now fill it. That was where Jesse James learned what survival really cost. That was where he stopped being a boy and became something else entirely. And somewhere in the back of his mind for the rest of his life, he could hear the sound of a shovel hitting earth, again and again and again. You have just witnessed one of the darkest chapters of American history. Stories like this, the ones they do not teach in school. Take time to research and tell properly. When you click super thanks, you are not just supporting a channel. You are saying, this history matters. Every contribution helps us uncover more forgotten stories from the war that nearly destroyed America. Bill Anderson would die just 1 month after the incident with Thomas Whitfield. Shot twice in the head, twice in the chest, during an ambush near Albany, Missouri. He was 24 years old. He had killed more Union soldiers than official records could count. He had earned a nickname that would echo through history, Bloody Bill. But in that moment, as he fell from his horse, as his blood soaked into Missouri dirt, as the Union soldiers swarmed over his body to claim their trophy, he was just a young man whose sister had been murdered, a young man who had responded to horror with horror, a young man who had shaped others in his image, so they might survive what he could not. Thomas Whitfield, Jesse James, Frank James, Cole Younger, Archie Clement, dozens of others, they all carried a piece of Bill Anderson with them. They all heard his voice when they faced impossible choices. The grave is right there. Start digging. Was Bill Anderson a monster? Yes. Was he also a victim? Yes. Was he a leader who kept his men alive through sheer force of will and terror? Also, yes. History is not black and white. Men are not heroes or villains. They are simply men, shaped by their circumstances, broken by their losses, becoming what they must become to survive. Thomas Whitfield understood that as he filled his cousin's grave. Jesse James understood it as he robbed his first train. And perhaps, if we are honest with ourselves, we understand it too. The only question that matters is this. If you were standing in that clearing, watching a man dig his own grave, knowing that your own hesitation could put you in the next one, what would you do? It is easy to say we would be different. Easy to believe that we would find some third option, some way out of the impossible choice. Easy to think that we would maintain our humanity when everything around us had lost theirs. But the men who rode with Bloody Bill Anderson thought the same thing. Before the war, before they saw their farms burn and their families die, before they learned what they were truly capable of, Thomas Whitfield thought he knew who he was. Right up until the moment Bill Anderson handed him that shovel, Jesse James thought he was just a boy looking for adventure. Right up until he watched Thomas bury his own cousin alive. Bill Anderson himself probably thought he was a good man once, before Kansas City, before Josephine, before the 63 scalps and the rivers of blood. We are all just one tragedy away from becoming something we never imagined. One loss, one betrayal, one impossible choice. That is what the Civil War taught a generation of Americans. That is what Bill Anderson's guerrillas lived every single day. And that is why this story matters. Not because it shows us monsters. We know monsters exist. History is full of them. It matters because it shows us how monsters are made. One choice at a time, one compromised value at a time, one buried piece of humanity at a time, until there is nothing left but the will to survive, and the sound of a shovel hitting dirt. Think about it, and leave your answer in the comments below. History does not judge, it only remembers. And now, you will remember Thomas Whitfield too, the man who dug for 20 minutes, the man who buried his own cousin, the man who finally understood what it meant to follow Bloody Bill Anderson. The shovel hit the dirt one final time, and then silence. Somewhere in Missouri there is still a mound of earth, covered now by a century and a half of leaves, grass, and forgotten history. If you knew where to look, you might still find it. A slight depression in the forest floor, a place where the trees grow a little differently. Samuel Whitfield lies there still, a young man who made the wrong choice, who put on the wrong uniform, who was captured by the wrong people, and somewhere above him, invisible now but eternal in its meaning, stands the ghost of Thomas Whitfield, shovel in hand, eyes empty, soul already dead, digging, forever digging, because some lessons never end, and some graves are never finished.